But there's functional deafferentation, which is really the most common form of deafferentation. This means a lack of normal sensory activity due to the loss of normal joint range of motion. So we could have a functional deafferentation, and if I'm a vertebra, and I move back and forth every day, or I'm a TMJ and I open and close every day, or move forward and back every day, or move laterally when I chew every day. Let's take a vertebra, it's easier for me to demonstrate. I'm a vertebra, I move back and forth every day. And as I move back and forth, there are stimuli to the nerve endings in the joints on either side, the muscle spindles, maybe the Golgi tendon organs, maybe. For certainly fascia receptors, even skin receptors are being stimulated as I move back and forth. And they're stimulating locally sensory input into the spinal cord, which then goes to higher centers into the cerebellum for coordination, and into the brainstem, and then further on into the cortex for representation on the opposite side of the brain of the sensory source. As I move back and forth, good health is related to normal function and normal input from this afferent supply, normal sensory input from into the central nervous system at all these levels in the spinal cord up into the cerebral cortex on the opposite side. Now, when something happens and for some reason I get stuck out of place, maybe the person I'm a part of steps off a curb, and all of a sudden I move back but not forth, move back but not forth. What happens to all that forth activity? What happens to all that activity in the part of the movement, all that stimulus of the muscle spindles and the joint receptors and even the fascia receptors, maybe the skin receptors? What happens to all that fourth part of activity? Nothing happens. It doesn't fire. We move back but not forth, we get a lack of normal sensory activity, or a functional deafferentation. And what that means is we're not getting normal input into the spinal cord for the normal spinal cord pathways and normal spinal cord reflexes. We're not getting normal input into the cerebellum on the same side for coordination of activity, of muscle activity and throughout the body. And we're not getting normal input into the brainstem that comes from the cerebellum and also from potentially from some of the sensory feedback from the joints and so on itself, nor are we getting feedback to the opposite cortex. So we get a whole bunch of stuff happening on the same side and the opposite cortex that's not appropriate when we get deafferentation. And those things don't just affect the function of those pathways. They don't just affect the tissues and their firing rates so that you don't get the normal reflex pathways. If you don't fire a neuron long enough, it gets, where its metabolism gets under functioning, just like if you don't fire a muscle. So if you have a muscle and you don't use it, it will atrophy. And then if you have a nerve and you don't use it, it will change the metabolism of that nerve and it will function differently. You can change the metabolic activity of a nerve. So we get the changes in both the normal reflex activity or the normal pathways of the muscle, but if you don't fire a muscle or don't fire a nerve long enough, you'll actually get changes in its metabolic rate, and it will function aberrantly sometimes as well, and it will sometimes function aberrantly to the point where it'll contribute to the brain on fire activity. So we get moved back but not forth. Now some chiropractor comes along and boom, adjusts my vertebral body and I'm starting to move, or maybe somebody balances a muscle and I start to move back and forth, and now we're getting normal stimulation into the spinal cord from all those joint receptors, muscle receptors, fascia, etc. receptors, and all the way up into the cerebellum and the brainstem and the cortex on the other side. Now we restore afferentation, and that's a big deal. And that big deal has got to do with, as we'll see especially in session 4 of this series, the fact that the brain itself might not be getting adequate stimulation, either for excitation or inhibition, to be able to make those neurons healthy.